Anyway, let me start talking about all that. Today we have a special guest. We've got Dr. Carey Vinzant. Vinzant?
Vinzant.
Why am I screwing up today? Because there's a camera on me. We've got Dr. Carey Vinzant here to speak with you guys today about St. Augustine, which is one of the first things in your chapter 8, which we were supposed to be discussing this week. So Dr. Vinzant is a theologian, a local clergyman, and a killer musician. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carey.
All right, welcome. The easiest way to talk about the importance of Augustine is if you know the answer, you heard the joke, where does a 500-pound gorilla sit? Anywhere he wants. All right, if you want to think about Augustine as the 500-pound gorilla of medieval thought, that's pretty accurate. He is uncontestedly the most influential and among the most prolific thinkers in the late patristic period, which is the time before the medieval period. So let me give you a few definitions to start. The word patristic derives from pater, father, and it's talking about the time when we have a group of thinkers in Christianity called the Fathers. This is a period that stretches from roughly 70 AD to 451, you could say, probably, at the Council of Chalcedon. After that, now you have to understand this, all of this in the patristic period is happening against the backdrop of the Roman Empire. Trying to understand the emergence of Christianity without the Roman Empire is like trying to understand Shakespeare without knowing anything about Elizabethan England. The Roman Empire is the backdrop against which Christianity emerged. And so when Rome falls, everything changes because Christianity has to figure out how to be Christian when there's no Rome. Imagine what it would be like for the United States to suddenly not exist anymore. Imagine being born here in Mississippi, growing up here, this is what you know, this is your home, this is your context, this is your heritage. And all of a sudden it doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. That's what happens when Rome falls. All of a sudden, everything that Christianity knew about government, economics, culture changed because there was no more Rome. Okay, so the medieval period then is the Western half of the Roman Empire trying to pick up the pieces. Remember that late in its history, the Roman Empire was divided into two parts. It's the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. The West was primarily Latin speaking, the East was primarily Greek speaking, but while the empire still stood, it was common for people across the empire to be bilingual because typically Roman law was done in Latin and business was done in Greek. So if you were going to be anybody, you needed to be able to do both. But when Rome fell, the Roman infrastructure that made trade, commerce possible was destabilized. Because while Rome still stood, you had what was called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And the easiest way to explain the Pax Romana, you've heard the phrase or words to the effect, don't start nothing, won't be nothing. Well, if you can imagine legions and legions and legions of burly Roman soldiers looking around the room and saying, don't start nothing, won't be nothing, that's the Roman peace. The Roman roads were safe because they were patrolled by the Roman armies. And so trade happened very freely across the empire. But all of a sudden, there's no more Roman peace, which means that it's a lot more risky proposition to get from one side of the Roman Empire to the other to do business. So it becomes less of an obvious investment to be bilingual. And as that happens, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire sort of drift apart. The Eastern Roman Empire becomes more and more Greek. The Western Roman Empire becomes more and more Latin because they just don't talk to each other as much anymore. It's harder to do now. So when we talk about what happens in the aftermath of the fall of Rome, we talk about it in two categories. In the East, we talk about the Byzantine period. So named after Byzantium, what we now know as Istanbul in Turkey. In the West, we call it the medieval period. So when we're looking at the Western Church, Augustine is without a doubt the most towering figure from the 300s until the 1200s. In fact, you could say the 1300s, because Thomas Aquinas was born in the 1200s, but he really wasn't massively influential during his own lifetime. So for a good solid millennium, if you were a Christian thinker in the West, Augustine was the man. Think about the impact that you would have to have, that you are the authority in an area for 1,000 years. That's who we're talking about. So with that being said, I want to give you a little backstory. Now, to understand what Augustine has to say, it's important to understand where he comes from. Augustine was an Algerian. Do y'all know where Algeria is? Okay. If you go straight south from Spain across the Straits of Gibraltar, the narrowest point at the western end of the Mediterranean Sea, you land in Algeria. So Algeria is yeah, that's right. Northwest Africa. That's right. And as it turns out, North Africa is a remarkably important place in Christian history in the first 4 or 5 centuries. So how does that happen? Well, it happens through Alexander the Great. It happens through the Romans. They set the stage for Christianity to spread into North Africa from the Levant, from what we now know as Palestine. All right. It came down around the southern rim of the Mediterranean. So in the 300s, we have Alexander the Great, who comes down and he conquers, well, everything in reach. And that includes Egypt. And so Egypt becomes sort of culturally and intellectually Greek from the mid 300s until, well, the Hellenistic influence lasted up through the Roman period. The Romans took over, they took control, but the Greek patterns of thinking didn't go away. They just coexisted alongside the Roman ones. So from 330-ish BC on, you have the Roman, you have the Greek intellectual presence in Egypt. Then you have the Punic Wars, which happened between 264 and 146 BC. The Punic Wars were Rome's wars with Carthage. Carthage is what we now call Tunisia. And it's at it's basically dead center at the north edge of Africa, right next to Egypt. And when Rome fought against Carthage, there was one very important, very famous general from Carthage. Anybody know? Elephants? Hannibal. Hannibal was the guy that we know because he was the only one who made Rome sweat. He was good at his job. He lost in the end, but he was the only general who, during its heyday, posed a threat to the Roman Empire. And he famously brought elephants across the Straits of Gibraltar, the narrowest point at the Mediterranean. It's only about 10 miles, I think, at its narrowest point. He ferried elephants across the Straits of Gibraltar and then brought them along the northern edge of the Mediterranean, across the Alps, and into Italy. He showed up to a gunfight with a tank. That's what an elephant was in the ancient world. So Hannibal was from Carthage, from what we now call Tunisia. And when Rome conquered Carthage, they were ruthless and they were vengeful. They smashed the city to the ground and salted the earth so nothing would grow there. Of course, time goes on, people don't stay gone, and Carthage reemerged as a city, but never as an empire. Now, and what did emerge was culturally and intellectually Roman. So what we see now then is a stage in North Africa that is set. And as Christianity emerges, oh, and by the way, one other name I should mention, and that's Cleopatra. You've heard of Cleopatra. She was the last great queen of Egypt. She was the descendant of one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy. And she was the one who ultimately made cause with the Romans through her relationship with Mark Antony, a Roman leader of the time. Contemporary, you've heard of Julius Caesar. In Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Mark Antony is one of the other major characters. Well, that's based on, in some measure, on true events. So from 58 BC-ish on, Egypt is now Roman as well. So by the time Christianity emerges, North Africa is a Roman province, just like Judea is, what we now know as Palestine. So, what's going on then? Well, Christianity emerges, and it's viewed pretty much by everybody at the time as this strange little subsect of Judaism. It doesn't really differentiate itself from Judaism. It's just that it's kind of like talking about Baptists, Presbyterians, Pentecostals. They're all Christians. They're all subgroups within Christianity. Well, in its earliest existence, Christianity was a smaller group within Judaism. For the first four decades that there were Christians, that was how it was thought about. Then, in 70 AD, Titus sacked Jerusalem. And at that point, Christianity kind of got kicked out of Judaism because the rest of the Jewish sects were taking up arms to fight against the Romans, to defend the temple. The Christians kind of looked at it and said, we don't need to fight for the temple. That's not the center of our faith in the way that it is for Jews. For the rest of the Jews, they still didn't think of themselves as particularly different from everybody else. But the rest of the Jewish community was not happy about this. And so they kind of disowned Christianity and said, hey, when the Romans smashed Jerusalem, the Christians didn't do anything about it. And so something very important happened. Judaism was a legal religion in the Roman Empire. In Rome, if you practiced an illegal religion, you were subject to persecution. And that took all kinds of forms, from being harassed by the cops to being hunted down and killed. And so when Judaism kicked Christianity to the curb, all of a sudden, Christianity lost that legal protection. All of a sudden, Christianity was no longer a legal religion, which meant that Christians were open to persecution. And as that happened, obviously, when the place where you're living is not safe, you start looking around and seeing if you can find a safer place. And so a Christian diaspora, a scattering, happens as Christians fled from persecution across the Roman Empire. They went all kinds of places. One of the places they went was North Africa. But even before that, as early as 42 AD, now let's put this in perspective. We put the date of the crucifixion between 26 and 30 AD. We put the earliest letters of St. Paul in the 40s, the mid 40s. So about the time that St. Paul was writing his first letters, or even slightly earlier, Mark, the writer of Mark's Gospel, had already gone to Egypt and established what we now know as the Coptic Orthodox Church there. Now, in the wake of that, a few things happen that we need to mention. A school, the catechetical school of Alexandria, emerges. And Alexandria is obviously it's named after Alexander. It's a very important intellectual center in Egypt. A catechetical school is simply a school that trains people to teach about religion. So basically, the catechetical school at Alexandria was focused on equipping people to teach Christianity. And some of the, well, two of the most important voices in early Christian thought came out of the catechetical school in Alexandria. The most important, well, the first one, let's mention, is Clement of Alexandria. The second was Origen, Origen. These two figures are hugely important. Clement, because he was an advocate of the idea that Christians should be able to use the language of the educated populace. So this is what we now call apologetics. The idea that being a Christian doesn't mean shutting off your brain and just believing, but that you can actually get out there as a Christian and hold your own in the marketplace of ideas. Clement is that dude. And he's at one end of the spectrum. There's another guy at the other end of the spectrum that we're going to talk about in a minute. Origen is the most important biblical interpreter of the first 3 centuries. He is the guy who is working with the available manuscripts, the available copies of the Bible, and compiling the best possible text, what we now call text criticism. So if anybody here who has a Bible, you owe that in part to Origen and the fact that it is of the quality that it is, and in fact they are of very good quality, is because the people who do this use the best available copies to compile what's called a critical text. Origen is the guy who pioneered that. And he also was very influential in terms of the method that you use for interpreting the Bible. Then, from Alexandria, let's shift over to Carthage. Carthage, where Alexandria tended to be more Greek culturally and intellectually, Carthage was more Roman, more Latin. And the most important figure that we see emerge from Carthage is a guy named Tertullian, Tertullian. Tertullian was a Carthaginian who was trained as a lawyer. And he was the first guy to do Christian theology in Latin. He wasn't thinking in Greek, he was thinking in Latin. The thing about thinking in a different language is it doesn't just change the words you use. Those words have a different cultural context. So when you translate from one language to another, you're always struggling not to just come up with equivalent words, but words that convey equivalent connotation. So I've told people it's probably not a good idea to walk up to somebody and say, I want to congratulate you on your impending wedding. Because usually when we say impending, the word that follows is doom, impending doom, right? Impending technically means something that you're expecting to happen. But the implication is that it's something that's really, really not good. So maybe let's not congratulate our friends on their impending wedding. That's connotation. It's the baggage that a word carries with it that isn't there necessarily in the dictionary definition, but it is there in the way it's used in a particular culture. Does this make sense? All right. That's part of the challenge of translation. And so doing Christian thinking in Greek has a whole set of associations that evokes various Greek philosophers and poets and authors, this kind of thing. And when you start doing that in Latin, there's a whole different set of those same kinds of people. And they don't do things quite the same way. And so Latin theology winds up looking somewhat different. And this happens very early. You have Greek Christianity and Latin Christianity existing side by side in North Africa from pretty early on. So after Tertullian, there's another figure, Cyprian, also from Carthage, another important voice in early Christianity. Cyprian more or less followed the road that Tertullian paved. He became very important in discussions about the sacraments, baptism, the Lord's Supper, and was an early voice in the formulation of what came to be called the African Rite, R-I-T-E, which was Roman Christianity expressed in the culture and language of North Africa. Now, a couple of other names that need to mention. These are all Alexandrian guys, well, Egyptian guys. Paul of Thebes. Paul of Thebes is the first known monastic. Probably most of you one time or another have seen a nun. Yeah. Nuns are female monastics, monks are male monastics. This pattern of life emerges pretty early. The first known person that we have is Paul of Thebes, around 250 AD. So we know about Paul of Thebes because Saint Anthony of Alexandria, who is the guy who tells us the story, went out into the desert and he met this guy. He met Paul of Thebes. And St. Anthony went on to become a major voice in the emergence of monasticism. And then his student, Athanasius of Alexandria. Athanasius was the bishop of Alexandria. He was important for a couple of reasons. One, because he was an important figure in the emergence of monasticism, but two, because he was the guy that at the Council of Nicaea in 325, when everybody had gone over to the side of the Arians, Athanasius stood his ground, he dug his feet in, and he wound up winning the argument. There was a phrase that went around at the time, Athanasius contra mundum, Athanasius against the world. There's a guy named William Plaker who was talking about Athanasius, and he says, I don't know if there's a patron saint of stubbornness, but if there's not, Athanasius is a good candidate. So all of these guys are paving the way for Augustine. Augustine is born in Algeria. His mother, Monica, was a devoutly Christian woman. Augustine was a wild child. He was brilliant, but he also liked the ladies. And when he was 17, he got involved. He wrote three major works, the first of which, he wrote a zillion things, but three of the most famous are the Confessions on Christian Doctrine and the City of God. And they're all tremendously important for different reasons. The Confessions is critically important because it is the first modern autobiography. It's the first time somebody told their life story and said, I did this. I did this. That was a revolution in literature. Augustine was that guy. Secondly, the City of God. He wrote that later in his life. And it is it's widely considered to be the first philosophy of history. He wrote it in the last few years before Rome fell to the Goths. And it's him looking around the declining Roman Empire and trying to sort of make sense of it all. First philosophy of history, first modern autobiography. And then third, he wrote a work called On Christian Doctrine. And On Christian Doctrine is probably the most important book ever written on how to study the Bible. If you've ever read a book related to, hey, this is how you study the Bible, it probably would not exist if Augustine hadn't written On Christian Doctrine. It is the benchmark work. It's the one that all the later ones are based on. I had a student one time say, well, I didn't really find anything here that I didn't already know. And I'm like, no, you're missing the point. If this book had been written, this stuff that you've learned other places wouldn't exist. It's the root of all of this stuff. So in his Confessions, Augustine just tells his life story. He talks about how as a young man, he was a wild one. He says, I came to I came to Milan and I was burning. I was in love with love. And was also somewhat tormented by that. He, early in his life, he left Algeria. Hippo, it was the city that he was from, Hippo Regius. He traveled to Carthage. He was educated there. Carthage, Tertullian, right? Roman Christianity, Latin Christianity. So he leaves Hippo and he travels to Carthage. He's educated there. Then he travels to Rome to study further. From there, he goes to Milan. And in Milan, he meets Ambrose, who would become his mentor. Ambrose was the bishop of Milan. And he's a fascinating figure because Ambrose actually didn't want to be bishop, but he was a local Christian businessman. And when the bishop of the time retired, all of the poor people gathered in the square and said, "Give us Ambrose, we will have Ambrose," because he had a reputation for being fair to everybody, no matter who they were. So he was really kind of made bishop. He didn't go looking for the job. They kind of grabbed him and said, "You're going to do this," and he was like, "Okay," and he wound up being one of the greats in Christian history. He was Augustine's mentor. Now, up until that time, Augustine had been a member of a sect called the Manichaeans. The Manichaeans are important primarily because of their view of Plato and the way that they took Platonism as more or less not just a philosophy, but as something of a religion. Now, you can see here, this is our brief overview. We talk about Plato, okay? I'm going to give you 3 patterns for thinking about philosophy. All right, so you can see here, each of these, we've got a muffin, right? Now, one way you can think about muffins and what makes them all muffins is that they all share the same recipe. There's a thing that kind of exists independently of all the muffins and makes them muffins. Does that make sense? Right? This is Plato. Plato has this idea that the idea of a thing, the definition of a thing, is what makes it real, and is the most real thing about it. So for Plato, the most real thing and the most important thing about muffins is the recipe, because that's what makes them all muffins, right? Then we have Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato. Aristotle thought about, and by the way, Plato called these things arches, beginnings. It's where we get the word archaeology. We usually translate that forms. So Plato thought that the forms were the most real and that they existed sort of in a world of ideas. So for Plato, the material world is less real than the world of ideas, the world of the forms. Now, Aristotle still believed that forms were a thing, but he didn't really think there was a world of ideas. For Aristotle, the most real thing is the muffins, and the form exists in the things. So he kind of thought about forms like DNA. You could say for Aristotle, he thought the forms were like the DNA of a muffin. Then, much later, more than 1,000 years later, you got a guy named Immanuel Kant. Kant comes up with the idea that the most real thing isn't really what's important. What's important is the process. And Kant says that recipes, that forms don't exist on their own. They're a function of the mind making sense as we think about muffins. Okay, so these are your three major patterns. Now, Augustine is the guy in Christian Platonism, and Platonism is the dominant thought pattern in Christianity until, well, through the first millennium of its existence. Aristotelianism doesn't really become significantly influential in Christianity until the Crusades. So you're talking the 1200s, really, or the 1100s, till the 1100s. So for the first 1,000 years that there were Christians, if they were thinking in terms of philosophy at all, they were thinking Platonism. And Augustine is a major voice in sort of cashing that out. All right. So let me give you just a couple of things about Augustine. His influence as a thinker stretches from his own time at the decline of the Roman Empire all the way across the medieval period into the Protestant Reformation and beyond. We find people who 1,000 years later look back and they go, no, Augustine had it right. John Wycliffe, forefather of the Reformation. John Calvin, the father of Reformed Christianity, Presbyterians, as we know them now. And Cornelius Jansen. In the 1600s, his most important work was called Augustine. Because through the whole medieval period, every time there's an argument, Augustine's name comes up. He is the 500-pound gorilla. He's the guy that you want to cite to win the argument. He comes up in arguments about predestination. There's a big one in the 700s. And there are three guys, Eriugena, Gottschalk, Hincmar. They're all quoting various takes on Augustine. Eriugena is quoting an early Augustinian work called On True Religion. Gottschalk is citing later Augustinian works like the Retractions. And Hincmar is citing a work called the Hypomnesticon, which Augustine didn't write, but people at the time thought he did. So you've got the early Augustine, the late Augustine, and the pseudo-Augustine. And this argument about predestination ultimately becomes an argument about who gets to claim Augustine as supporting their side. And the same thing happens with discussions about the Lord's Supper. Around the same time as the argument about predestination, there's one about communion between a guy named Ratramnus, who's putting Augustine's view forward, and a guy named Radbertus, who's essentially putting Ambrose's view forward. And the same argument happens again in the 1100s between a guy named Berengar, who's advocating an Augustinian position, and a guy named Lanfranc, who again is the voice for the Ambrosian position. When we look at the medieval period, the one figure that casts a long shadow, sets the stage for medieval thought, and defines how Christians think in the Western Church for more than 1,000 years, that man is Augustine. All right, time.